Chris Anderson.
In Lexington.
In Lexington. In front of the historic Buckman Tavern. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, and thanks to Stephen Ambrose Tours for their help and support. And
Yes.
we offer a rich array of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com.
Okay.
And also, we want to just say welcome to everybody who's here, and mention that we are going to be talking this week. It's going to be an encore episode.
Because, it's going to be live this week.
Was going to be live, but I am busy in St. Louis at a Ghost Army event. Oh, cheers. Okay, cheers. And so we're going to be an encore episode with the Patrick Bishop talking about the fall of France. Liberation.
No, not the fall of France. That happened in 1940. Liberation of Paris, 1944.
Hey, let us know what you're drinking, because clearly we already have that. And
flip for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And tune in. I don't even know what else to say, Chris. Why don't you give us a cue?
Open.
The bar is open. And Chris, before you introduce our guest, I'm in Paris today. It is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Paris. I went out to the Rue Leclerc, the street that General Leclerc came down when he came into Paris on August 25th, 1944. They had a military parade, speech by Emmanuel Macron, all the celebrations of the anniversary. So I thought I would just show you a 1-minute video. You ready?
Okay.
All right. There it is.
Oh, fancy. I saw that. That tank looked familiar when I saw down here. He kind of gets around.
Oh, they must have really zipped up the road to get here.
Yeah, that's kind of neat. So were you singing the Marseillaise too, or do you just kind of?
I was a neutral journalist.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So who are we talking to today? What's going on?
It's kind of it's just to show you how trendy and current on top of things we are. Our guest this week is Patrick Bishop, and Patrick is the author of many, many, many great books, among them Fighter Boys and Bomber Boys. He spent 25 years as a foreign correspondent covering major conflicts around the world, including the Falklands. And when he's not writing for great history books, he is the co-host with one of our alumni, Saul David, of Battleground and Battleground 44, which is a podcast which focuses on, right now, the war in the Ukraine and also the year 1944. So those should be checked out. He was with us earlier to talk about Operation Jubilee, which, of course, as you know, is near and dear to me because it involves Canadians. But he's here this week to talk about his new book, Paris 1944, Occupation, Resistance, Liberation. So there we go. Hey,
Patrick Bishop. How are you? Welcome.
Great to be back. Very, very nice to see you both again.
Yeah, we appreciate it. So since it's that time of year, 80th anniversaries galore, I'm happy to start this. And I guess I'd start, my first kind of intro question is, in your introduction, you say, at its heart, Paris was as much an idea as a reality. And so you talk a lot about myth and reality in the book. So kind of what did you mean by that when you say myth and reality?
Well, it's a kind of confection, really, Paris, isn't it? when we visit there, we've already heard a hell of a lot about it. We've got an idea of what it is. It's a very positive idea. It's a place where dreams come true, I suppose you'd say, particularly if you're a kind of a creative bent or a romantic bent. Then Paris is the kind of capital of love, or historically, this is where it's been seen. It was the kind of throbbing heart of the art world for many a decade. And so it's kind of synonymous with lots of positive things like freedom, personal freedom, political freedom, beauty, adventure, and romance. So it's got this sort of unique place, I think, in the world's imagination in terms of having a personality. Very few cities have a gender. If you think about it, people always talk about Paris. It's always a woman. It's a particular type of woman. It's not a kind of a wife. It's a mistress, I think, is putting it. But as I say in the book, when these other famous great European cities fell to the Germans, their fate, people of course felt bad about it, but they didn't feel this kind of sense of personal loss, which seems to be the case when Paris fell in June 1940. These kind of reverberations of dismay really went around most of the world, not the entire world, of course, but it was a shocking event. And I think that's why the liberation carried this extra charge, why it was not just a great milestone on the road to eventual victory and defeat of the Nazis. It was also a kind of a sign that the end is near, and what better place to be the first to feel, the wind of freedom than Paris, this city that we all love.
So at the beginning of the book, we see Adolf Hitler touring Paris and feeling honestly a little bit of that love, regarding it kind of as an inspiration. And then near the end of the book, we see him suggesting to General von Choltitz that it should be left a field of ruins. Now, granted, a lot happens in the 4 intervening years, but how does he really feel about Paris?
Well, I think, he's a narcissist, as we'd say today, Hitler. So initially, his affection for it, such as it is, he'd never actually been there before. Hitler hadn't really been anywhere. So the first time he goes to Paris is as a conqueror. But he knows Paris very well from his days as an would-be art student in Vienna. One of his qualities is he's got this incredible memories. It's fantastic visual memory. So he is a keen student of architecture. And so when Paris falls, he decides he's not going to have a triumphal entry into Paris, strutting down the Champs-Élysées with his army behind him. He's going to go, he's going to reveal his other side, or this other side that he nurtures. And he often says, if destiny hadn't called me, I would have been an artist. That's what I really am. So he goes on this sort of away day trip with some of his artist buddies, like Arno Brecker, the sculptor who does this sort of huge, over-masculine, muscle-bound, gigantic sculptures, and Albert Speer, his sort of pet architect, and a couple of others. And he does this lightning tour in Paris, and his first stop is the Opera Garnier, the opera that we all know from bang in the middle of Paris, which most of us, I think, find a bit of a sort of eyesore these days. It's very much out of fashion, that kind of architecture. But this was for Hitler. This was like the acme of architectural achievement. So basically, what he's saying, he's going there, and he loves Paris because Paris. He's got rather conventional ideas about art. So Paris was, to people of his generation, really the kind of gold standard of what a great city should look like. So it's really this conventional view that Paris is this sort of monument to civilization. But of course, being Hitler and being at the head of a movement that wants to re-establish Germany as the heart of European civilization, Paris. Okay, so it's got its good points, but Berlin is going to be 10 times better. So, but it's very sort of remarkably unimaginative. So when they go to the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe at the top, he says, okay, we're going to have this victory arch in Berlin too, but it's going to be bigger than the Arc de Triomphe, and the great avenue that leads down from it is going to be 100 yards longer than the Champs-Elysees. It's rather kind of banal view of what counts as greatness and majesty.
Looking at crowd size.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah, strange as that.
So, I mean, as you know, Patrick, from when you were with us before, Rick and I love to kind of steal ideas from people who've written a lot more books than we have. So you kind of use the approach of telling the story through a bunch of different personalities. So could you tell us like why you decided on that approach and what you hoped by having kind of these little mini stories within the story helps move it along? And
yeah, well, I was trying to get a cast of characters who somehow represented something about Paris and also something about the story. And it was there were actually quite a few to choose from, and I wanted to, I want people to read the book, so I want to have some famous names in there, people who actually fascinate me anyway. I've always been fascinated by Hemingway. I know he's out of fashion these days, but I still think he was a great writer, not such a great human being. And Robert Capa, as well as being a very fine photographer, is also one of my heroes as being a very human character. He had his flaws, but there's something rather wonderful about his joie de vivre, streak of melancholy, and great bravery. So, putting people like that in was both fun, and they actually illustrated a part of the story. In one sense, they're both Parisians, they're both adopted Parisians. Hemingway made his name in Paris, Capa made his name in Paris. And so they got very strong associations with the city, and they both loved the city. So that's really kind of bringing the kind of broader audience into the story, I suppose. But then you want to have characters who represent an aspect, a key strand in the narrative. So there's a kind of, not exactly a good German, but a kind of okay German, a bad German, a collaborator, a resistor, various shades actually. And then some people who just had to be there. But the idea is to try and, as you say, keep the pace up, and as a kind of consumer of books, I've got a fairly short attention span. So if the pace flags, I find myself kind of getting losing interest quite rapidly. So I'm always aware of that when I write. And I think having a strong, colourful, pungent cast of characters is a good way of telling the story. I mean, I'm very devoted to telling the story and getting it right and trying to make people think slightly differently about it if they have a preconceived idea of what liberation was about. Exposing a few myths. I'm not saying any of this is unknown to people who know the story reasonably well, but I think the overall idea is to make people tell the story in a vibrant way and make people think a bit about it.
Well, you start the book, with the Germans taking Paris and talk about Paris during the war. How did the people of Paris respond to German occupation? I mean, are they despondent? Are they sullen? Are they angry? Are they, what is kind of their mood? When this starts, when the Germans have taken over?
It's very mixed. I think all those emotions you mentioned are there, but I think first and foremost there are two overriding feelings. One is shock, and the other is relief, because the collapse of France after the May the 10th offensive is launched from the east is incredibly sudden, and the French people have been told that we have this fantastic army, we have this Maginot Line that's going to defend us, and so the speed of the collapse takes them by surprise, takes ordinary French people by surprise, and it takes everyone by surprise. So when the Germans are at the gates, there isn't this sort of feeling as there was in August 1914 that we've got to stop them. Instead, the government abandons the city, and instead of fighting a battle at the gates of the city as they did at the Battle of the Marne, the army is told to lay down its arms and basically wait for the armistice to be signed. So there's confusion on top of that kind of feeling of relief that it's all over. There's this deep confusion about what comes next, and there's no one really in charge. The government's sort of moving from place to place. It then very rapidly kind of votes out the old order, the old Third Republic, and installs Philippe Pétain as essentially a kind of dictator figure. And that comes as something of a comfort to most people, because Pétain is probably the most respected person in France. He was the victor at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. He's regarded as someone of enormous authority and someone who can be relied upon to do the right thing. So when he says, okay, no more fighting, we're going to sign the armistice, and henceforth we're going to collaborate with the German occupiers. Now, collaboration didn't have the stigma that we now associate with that word. It was regarded more as a cooperative thing. We were going to be in France and Germany. We're going to be in some kind of partnership, and that, of course, turned out to be a very empty notion quite quickly. So yeah, there's this kind of confusion, and there's a lot. Basically, there's this. Let's wait and see what happens next. Let's wait and see what the Germans do. We all know what they're capable of, but Pétain tells us it's okay. So let's see. And so for the first period, there is a sort of honeymoon period that lasts a couple of months. The Germans behave very respectfully. Their orders are to treat the French with dignity and with respect. Certainly didn't go for the Poles or for any of the other conquered territories. And so there's a feeling that, well, maybe this was the right thing to do. That De Gaulle, who's just a voice on the radio at that point, not many people have even heard that voice on the radio. He's a quixotic figure. He's someone who's done something which turns out to be the right move, but at the time seemed like a very odd thing to do to a lot of people.
Well, Patrick, I mean, I accept that this is going to open up a big topic and too much to talk to in an hour, but it always surprises me when I read about this, the level of collaboration, and as you say, it doesn't have the pejorative sense that it does now, but could you maybe talk about, kind of this attachment to Pétain and how some people in France, I don't want to say are entirely okay with what's happened, but they're willing to accept this. What is their kind of view, and I guess why is there more active opposition sooner? I mean, a lot more people seem to acquiesce in this.
Yeah, well, that's something I think that is still troubles the French to this day. The degree of acquiescence there was with the new order. Now, there's lots and lots of different things going on here. So at one level, you've got people who are deeply conservative, they're often Catholic, they're often wealthy, and this combination adds up to a cast of mind where you think, well, maybe this isn't so bad after all. They didn't have much affection for the Third Republic. It was regarded as corrupt, immoral, etc. So now that the Germans, okay, this is a disaster. No one pretends it's not a disaster, but out of this disaster may come some good, because we've got Pétain there, who's telling us that we're returning to the values that we hold dear, to family, to nation, to work, to hard work, decency, and what Victorian type values, as they put it in British terms. So, out of this catastrophe, quite a few people, and those people with property, those people with something to lose, can create a narrative where actually this may not be such a terrible thing after all. Allied with them, you've got people who are ideologically actually on the side of the invaders. So you've got various intellectuals. One of my characters is Robert Brasilac, who was a young up-and-coming journalist and novelist. And there were lots of people like Brasilac who actually, in the great sort of ideological schism of the 1930s, people tended to go who thought hard about it went in opposite directions. Often the same kind of people, they might be at university together, and 10% of the class would go off and become communists, and 10% of the class would go off and become fascists. So it was a time of where people kind of were dragged to the polar opposites of the competing ideologies at the time. So those right-wing types thought, oh, actually, this is pretty good, and the Germans were very good at flattering them and giving them lots of opportunities to write, giving them jobs, giving them money, giving them trips to Germany, etc. So they had sort of, the Germans had these sort of intellectual allies in people like Brasillac. So, all that on the right side of the picture would lead you to, why would you take up arms against the Germans? Again, let's wait and see what happens. The Germans at this point look as if they're almost certain to win the war. The idea of Britain's the only one still in the fight. America hasn't come in yet, and so it seemed to be both a sensible thing to do and perhaps an intelligent. It might actually all turn out quite well. On the kind of middle and left side of the picture, I think it's much more a question of just what do you actually do? You haven't got an organization. The communists, of course, who are the most able to actually offer any serious resistance at this point, are essentially allied to the Germans, because Moscow is telling them, because of the Hitler-Stalin pact signed in just before the war broke out, the orders coming from Moscow to the rank and file in France is lie low, don't do anything to antagonize the Germans. And indeed, some of the underground press is urging the comrades to fraternize with German soldiers, saying, the German soldier, if you see him in a bar, buy him a drink. He's a proletarian like you. He's a comrade. And of course, after Barbarossa, after the Hitler invades Russia in June 1921, the orders changed to, if you see a German in a bar, shoot him. That's
messaging.
You got to get a new creative director on that advertising there. So violence does kind of break out after the Germany invades Russia. Violence breaks out in Paris. It's really right around the same time. And this is a year after the occupation. It's 3 years before the liberation, but things start to change. And how does it change? And at what point? I guess I was struck by the fact that there's a lot of violence, and it's back and forth escalating violence. But at some point also, a lot of people are trying to stay out of it. And then at some point, remaining passive, remaining neutral kind of doesn't cut it anymore. So talk about all that a little bit.
Yeah, it's it really is the communists who start the whole thing with this program of assassinations of German officers wherever they can find them. It's not very extensive because they haven't really got the wherewithal to do anything very dramatic. They haven't got any weapons. The SOE, the British organization that's meant to support resistance movements, is not very good at getting weapons to to people in Paris. They get a certain amount of supplies, nothing very significant to the countryside resistance, who actually, it's a kind of a separate story that I won't go into it here, but we'll just stick to Paris for the moment. So but what happens to actually swell the ranks of the resistance and to bring in recruits from outside the Communist Party is this program of German reprisal. So the Germans, in their usual way, massively overreact. And so for every German that's killed, there's 20, 30, sometimes 50 hostages taken out and shot. Now this, as anyone could have told them, has an immediate sobering effect, but a long-term encouraging effect, in the sense that people think, now we know what we're dealing with. Extreme measures are the only ones that are going to work against an enemy like this. And so in the long term, it's actually a bad policy. And indeed, some of the Germans themselves see that. But the communists still really run the show in Paris right up until the end. Over those years between the autumn, or rather late summer of 1941 and the liberation in August 1944, you get the net widening. So you get people of all political stripes, including some pretty right-wing people, joining the fray. But most of the fighting is done by the communists.
So Patrick, well, I have a very dear friend who is a gendarme, and he's also a bit of a history geek. And I remember talking to him at one point as he's embarking on his law enforcement career, and he was a little troubled when he looked at kind of how pro-occupation a lot of the gendarmes or the gendarmerie was, which I was thinking about as I read the book, because of the police. And maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of how French officialdom or the French bureaucracy is supporting the occupation and how they're handling this whole situation, because it's sort of a mixed bag, I think.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the occupation couldn't have worked without the connivance of the French state. So the Vichy state, as it was called because of its location in a spa town in the sort of central south France, really acted as the agents of the Nazi occupiers. Literally, every official was told, cooperate with the Germans, do what they ask of you, and don't create a fuss. And so that extends to everyone, to every official, every prefect, every mayor. Some of them were secretly doing a little bit here and there to hinder the Germans or to help the resistance in some way. But per force, there wasn't that much they could do. But I think it's the police who really have the biggest question to answer, which is, how were you able to just switch sides so seamlessly, apparently, and start doing the Germans' dirty work for them, which involves rounding up your own countrymen who happen to be in the resistance, or happen to be members of the Communist Party, or happen to be Jewish. So very few of them actually resigned from the force or refused to do the work or formed sort of underground cells to try and sort of in some way hinder what the Germans were trying to do. And this continues right up until the eve, literally, of the liberation of Paris. So the French police in the capital are just as keen on aiding and abetting the various German policies as their as their colleagues elsewhere. But about a few days before it's obvious that that things are coming to a head, the Paris police force suddenly changes its tune and goes on strike. Now, this is the kind of basically the curtain raiser for the liberation itself. And it turns out, I think some cynics might chuckle at this, that inside the police force, there are all these resistance movements that hitherto hadn't actually done anything, but suddenly they spring up very conveniently.
Like magic.
Yeah, and it turns out the communists are also in there, and the Gaullists are in there, and the socialists are in there. And they literally turn their coats, and they go from being oppressors to being freedom fighters. And indeed, there's a funny story I tell in the book about a communist resistant who, when the police then actually take up arms against the Germans on August the 19th, and he finds himself fighting on the barricades alongside one of these policemen. He says, "Oh, I recognize you. You arrested my mate last Saturday." So he said, "Well, no, I'm a freedom fighter now." So I think you'd have to be very naive to buy the narrative that the French police then wrote for themselves about how all along they'd been sort of good patriots, and they were just waiting for the moment to strike.
There's a lot of myth making in this story. I want to remind people that we're chatting with Patrick Bishop about his book Paris 1944, about the liberation of Paris, which happened 80 years ago. And August 25th, today, is the day that's often celebrated, although it takes place over a period of time. So you have, and you tell the story of the resistance and the different factions of the resistance and the folks who make that work. But there's another side to this story as well, which is the Army, the U.S. Army with the French 2nd Division under Leclerc as part of it. General Eisenhower and General Bradley say that they want nothing to do with Paris. They would like to bypass Paris and kind of ignore it completely. Why do they want to bypass Paris? And then what convinces them that, well, maybe we should try to do something?
It's made perfect sense not to go hell for leather for Paris once they were ashore properly and securely in Normandy, because the point of the exercise, the point of the Battle of Normandy, is to defeat the German army and then drive its remnants back across the Rhine and get into Germany itself as quickly as possible. And so diverting to Paris is going to A, take time, and B, putting a strain on resources. You're inheriting a problem, a massive potential human problem of feeding the population, basically looking after, taking care of all their needs, and that's going to soak up a lot of logistics. So very sensibly, the idea was we'll just bypass Paris. Once we've gone past Paris, it's obvious to the garrison that they've basically, the battle is over. And if we're lucky, they'll just pack up and go home. And if we're unlucky, we'll basically come back and deal with them later on. So that's the smart thing to do. However, that thing we were talking about at the beginning of the show, this place that Paris occupies in the imagination of the world makes that quite a tricky thing to do. So when Omar Bradley says famously, to me, Paris was just an ink spot on the map. Well, that may be how a great soldier like Bradley saw it, but the rest of the world didn't see it like that. And so it seemed odd that you wouldn't go and liberate Paris. And then on top of that, of course, you've got enormous pressure being put on Eisenhower to go and free the French capital, coming, of course, from de Gaulle. Now, de Gaulle paints this picture of impending disaster. We've got to always remember that this is going on while Warsaw is being basically razed to the ground by the Germans, because the Polish resistance have risen up there and are now being annihilated, along with tens of thousands of civilians, by the Germans. Now there's a uprising brewing in Paris. So the threat that de Gaulle sort of makes, a veiled threat really, is that if you don't go and liberate Paris, then this uprising could easily turn into another Warsaw. You will have blood on your hands. You'll have the lives of tens of thousands of dead French men and dead French women to atone for. And so this kind of carries a bit of weight. And then eventually this sort of combination of de Gaulle's pleas, really. De Gaulle never pleaded for anything. De Gaulle was sort of demands, reports coming out of the city that indeed the uprising has started, and that there's a disastrous situation potentially looming, and this thought that if the whole place is blown to smithereens by the departing Germans, which seem to be a distinct possibility, then it won't look very good for Eisenhower, who did know Paris well and loved Paris, and indeed for the Allies in general. So he kind of reluctly, but enthusiastic, but wholeheartedly, should I say, orders the diversion to be undertaken. The first unit in will be the Leclerc division, the 2nd Armored Division, the 2e Blindé. And he's doing de Gaulle a huge favor by agreeing to this, because on that order rests the myth that de Gaulle built up with huge enthusiasm and to great effect, that it was the French that actually liberated Paris. Very little mention is made of the fact that the 4th Infantry Division, the US 4th Infantry Division, the Ivy, was right behind them, or indeed that the French were completely equipped and uniformed by the Americans, and indeed that the Allies had actually won the Battle of Normandy, more or less.
Those are mere details, Patrick. You don't want to. You don't want to. Myth making doesn't involve details.
But it's incredible how durable it was, that myth. I mean, of course, if you looked at it, I mean, it was pretty obvious from the get-go that this wasn't the case. But people, one of the points I make about Paris is that people believe what they want to believe about it. So, I mean, just as a bit of a side note, but if you go to Paris, as you no doubt know, Rick, and you go out and try and find a nice restaurant and have a nice meal, you'll be hard pressed to actually get a decent meal at a decent price and with kind of friendly service. French food, I travel a lot, as you guys do. French food, Parisian food, is the worst I've eaten anywhere. And I've been paid through the nose for the privilege of being sneered at by some French waiter while I'm doing it. There are one or two places which I'll tell you guys to get you next time.
Yes, please.
But it is, I lived there for 4 years recently with my family, and people used to come and stay the whole time, as they always do if you've got a flat in Paris. And they'd come and say, tell us about your favorite, you must have some favorite, secret little restaurant where the food's great, the prices are okay, it's real traditional. But it didn't exist. This place did not exist. It's kind of okay places, But this fantasy persists, very ably stoked by the French that they're still the gastronomic capital of the world. You could eat, I was in Warsaw the other day, you'd eat much better in Warsaw, you'd eat much better in Kiev, virtually anywhere in Europe, you will eat much, much better than you do in Paris. Sorry, Parisians, but it's true. And it's true. It's true.
I'm going to
check.
I have to leave now and pack up and go to another hotel. Yes. Okay. So somebody asked me this the other day on the tour I'm on. And so I will just ask you, Patrick, and then I will take your answer along with your comments about French restaurants. How much fighting actually took place in Paris? And was this fighting that involved the resistance against the Germans, or did it involve the French Second Armored Division under General Leclerc, or were the Americans involved in fighting in Paris? What's the story?
Well, it was a bit of all those things, but certainly the initial fighting was done by actually, strangely enough, it was done by the police. So when the police on Saturday the 19th of August, they take over the prefecture, which is the police headquarters on the banks of the Seine. Anyone who's been to Paris, which I imagine most of your listeners have, will know it's right next to Notre Dame. You can't miss it. It's a huge, great structure. And so they started sort of shooting out of the windows at the Germans as they went up and down the quays of the Seine. And that sort of was augmented by various small actions that were launched by the French fighters of the interior, who are basically sort of, most of them communists or leftists. And they start doing the same, shooting up German convoys, attacking German groups of Germans wherever they see them. But of course, again, they've got very few weapons. So their technique is to ambush some German trucks and then dart out, grab the weapons, and build up their armory that way. And so this goes on all over the city at various degrees of intensity. I say all over the city, it's not actually all over the city, because in the west of the city, the 16th arrondissement, the 8th arrondissement, they're very sort of posh. The people there are not given to revolutionary activities. So it does tend to be in the center, on the left bank, particularly in the 6th arrondissement, and various other points elsewhere. So yeah, it's a kind of ragged sort of insurgency, but it's not actually causing the Germans that many problems. And the German commander, von Choltitz, he actually could have reacted much more fiercely than he did. For example, he sent up a couple of tanks to the prefecture when the police take over. But instead of bombarding the place and could have caused a huge number of casualties, he actually wants to keep the lid on the situation, because he's now making his own calculations about what's going to happen to him. He doesn't want to go down in history he knows that Paris is going to fall, and he knows he's probably going to be captured. So he doesn't want to start committing atrocities that might end up with him facing some sort of war crimes tribunal and dangling at the end of a noose.
So
And now on the sorry, I just
No.
opened. So this is actually the Allied troops, the Leclerc Division and the 4th Infantry Division, the Ivy, don't show up really until the evening of the 24th, and then they don't come into the city until the 25th. Well, there's a certain amount of fighting, but it's kind of token resistance really that's put up by the Germans inside the city, and the whole thing is over by 7 o'clock in the evening, and really largely over by mid-afternoon.
It's about one of the things that I found fascinating. Obviously, we know about de Gaulle. There's impressions about de Gaulle, but you really bring Eisenhower into the story in a way that I usually don't see. So, if you could maybe touch a little bit on Eisenhower's relationship with de Gaulle, because he seems to be the only person, surely the only "quote unquote" Anglo-Saxon who's able to form any kind of relationship with de Gaulle. Then it seems to be a good one.
Yeah, I think it all goes back to de Gaulle, Eisenhower's understanding of France. He was there in the 1920s. He was posted there as a sort of military attaché, really, and he was very good at mixing with French politicians, understanding all the complexities of the French political situation, and so he sort of got de Gaulle in a way that I think other Allied commanders didn't, and understood what he was trying to do. And what he was trying to do was to try and tie together all these, disparate, very mutually hostile political traditions and elements in France under his leadership. And he took de Gaulle at his word. And he saw in de Gaulle a man of destiny and the sort of gigantic figure that was needed if there was going to be any kind of order following the chaos of liberation. So he was prepared to bet on him, if you like, and it turned out to be a good bet.
So you mentioned the German commander, von Choltitz, and he is sometimes credited as the person who saved Paris. I think he credited himself.
Yeah,
as that person.
It's really him saying that more than anyone else.
Because he didn't follow Hitler's direction, he said, to leave the city a field of ruin. So you say in the book that Eisenhower should be considered the person who saved Paris, but how much credit should von Choltitz get? I mean, he could have. He came with a pretty serious Eastern Front background. He could have come in there and really just gone into the fanatical mode, and history would be very different if he had.
Yeah, that is true. And I think the key to Choltitz is that he's an opportunist. He's like a lot of these Prussian, military caste figures who, at the beginning of the war, is prepared to take Hitler at his word and sort of see him as the military genius, especially after the kind of brilliant successes of the opening phase of the war. So he's prepared to actually regard him as someone who really can remake Germany's fortunes. But of course, so when he's on the Eastern Front, as you rightly say, he's a very enthusiastic carrier out of orders. So his men, cordon off places so as the SS can go in and round up the Jews and cart them off and kill them. So he's very complicit in these war crimes, as he himself admits when he's in captivity. Excuse me, and being secretly recorded. He says, "Yeah, I did. I carried out my orders, enthusiastically, and now I regret it. But it was a bit late then." But when he's in Paris,
when
he's in Paris, he's weighing the odds now. What's going to happen next? And he wants to kind of keep all the balls in the air, and that includes trying to convey to Berlin that he's still a loyal Hitlerite. Because on July 22nd, of course, you've had the von Stauffenberg bomb plot, and Hitler survived that. And so the purge of the military caste of people just like von Choltitz, who are complicit in the plot. The plot is very widespread, and so hundreds of his peers are being shot on very, often on quite sort of flimsy evidence. So he doesn't want to die at the hands of his own people, and equally he doesn't want to die at the hands of the liberators of Paris. And so he's got to try and present himself as being this humanitarian. So I think he did a brilliant job of that. So he did, after the war, he was even in France regarded by some as being the man who saved Paris. But the question I raise in the book is, could he actually, well, first of all, it wasn't in his interest to do it. And secondly, could he have actually blown up Paris as Hitler did indeed order him to do, if he'd wanted to? And the answer, I think, is no, he couldn't. It turns out there's a certain number of demolition charges have been placed, a certain number of key monuments had been mined, etc. And so preparations had been made to destroy Paris and reduce it to a field of ruins, as Hitler wanted. But by the time the order actually came to go ahead and do it, the conditions just weren't there to the kind of calm and the order and the time you needed to actually blow the place up. Those conditions didn't obtain, and that's something you can actually give credit to the resistance for, because they had made movement around the city for the Germans very difficult, dangerous indeed. And so had Choltitz gone ahead and said, okay, we're going to carry out the field of ruins order, he wouldn't have the wherewithal to do it.
So, Patrick, obviously, Paris is liberated. We're celebrating that. And, we'll talk forever about who's the most responsible or not responsible. But in the book, you say there's a first draft of history. Of the liberation. So what is the first draft of history, and has it really moved from that mark, or are we still with the first draft?
Is written by de Gaulle himself. He claimed that this speech he made when he arrives at the Hotel de Ville with Paris City Hall, a tremendous scene. You can actually see it on YouTube. It's he's standing there. De Gaulle very, very rarely showed emotion, but you can see him gulping, his sort of atoms up and bobbing as he begins this fantastic speech, probably the best speech of his life, when he says, Paris outraged, Paris broken, but Paris liberated by itself. This is where the foundation stone of the myth is laid. And liberated by the armies of France. There is no armies of France. There's one division, which, as I say, is working
with Spanish.
with
the Spanish outriders on it, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's another thing we should talk about. And then by the France that fights, the France that surrenders. Well, the France that fights, that idea had taken a bit of a beating in June 1940 when the French army just melted away and let the Germans walk into Paris. So almost everything he says is, as I say in the book, it's what Meghan Markle would say is it was his truth. It was de Gaulle's truth, i.e. not very true at all. And so from then on, of course, it is very convenient. So everyone in Paris goes along with this idea that they liberated themselves. Why would you not? You're not going to start so, well, hang on a minute. And again, obviously, Eisenhower doesn't sort of rain on de Gaulle's parade. Indeed, talking of parades, he gives him this fantastic parade the day after the liberation, on that Saturday, the 26th, when he walks down the Champs-Élysées. He's basically made leader of France by acclaim. Everyone out there is chanting his name. Again, you see fantastic images of him walking down. He's very sort of awkward man. He's very tall, incredibly tall by French standards. Most French men were about 5'4", and he's at least a foot taller than them. So you see this very lanky figure walking down the Champs-Élysées, and he doesn't know what to do with his arms. So he does this sort of strange movement, sort of moving them up, his hands up from the sides of his body, kind of pivoting from his elbows, as if he's sort of pumping up the crowd in a funny way. But he is this kind of almost kind of extraterrestrial character. Only no one knew what he looked like, really. They'd only just heard his voice on the radio. And he just basically takes the whole thing over by sheer power of personality.
Well, well, there's so many places we could go, but you said we should talk about La Nouve, so I think we should talk about these. This is the scouts or recon people for the 2nd Armored Division. Is this company under their commander Drul? Yeah, and they are mostly Spanish, but they are actually the first ones. They actually get into Paris on the night of the 24th, right? And they had a ceremony last night. I don't know if any of those folks are still alive, but they had a ceremony last night to honor them.
Oh, did they? I'm very pleased to hear that. Yeah, because they were. Yeah, it's another irony of the story is that it's a fluke really that Leclerc says, he's straining at the leash to get into Paris. Night is falling. He's only about 10 miles from the city centre, and they can't. The whole unit, the whole division can't move in that night. He wants someone to get in that night, someone to get there as quickly as possible. He turns to Raymond Dron, who is the captain in charge of this outfit, this company called La Nueve. They call it. It's the 9th.
La Nueve, sorry,
but La Nueve, and they call it the Spanish name for the 9th because most of the people in it are Spanish Republicans who are refugees from the Civil War. So these are good, leftist fighters who've been defeated. They've made their way over the Pyrenees into France. What happens when they get to France? They're put into jail. Well, they're put into concentration camps essentially by the French government, and then a lot of them are shipped off to North Africa, where they work in these sort of labor battalions. So they've got no reason at all to feel particularly affectionate towards the French, but they do love liberty and they do hate fascists. So when the Anglo-American invasion of North Africa happens in the autumn of 1942, they join up with the Free French and fight their way across North Africa. Then they land in Britain in the early summer of 1944, and then they land in France after the bulk of the invading force at the end of, when is it? I can't remember exactly. Anyway, sort of before the liberation. So they get into Paris first. So it's another irony of the story that the people who actually liberate Paris are not French troops at all. Most of them are Spanish. They're commanded by a Frenchman, sure. And they're Spanish Republicans who've been treated by and large appallingly by the old French government. But there we go. They didn't bear any grudges. They were genuinely terribly moved by the reception. I think they're a fine bunch of men. It's great to hear that they got their due today.
So Patrick, it's I don't know. I think every nation obviously has their own myths, and there are certainly a lot of myths around the Second World War. I know obviously the UK has got a particular version of the Battle of Britain, and the Americans like to think that they won D-Day all by themselves. And obviously your book deals a great deal with myth and reality. But in terms of Paris, is it will that ever change, or is the myth actually of the liberation more important than the reality of?
Yeah, but I don't know what you think, Rick and Chris, but myths are necessary, aren't they? Sometimes, and they can be positive. And I'm not the kind of historian that just feels this need, as some do, to kind of chip away at the foundations of a story and watch it collapse. When I did my book on the Battle of Britain pilots, it was almost a kind of circular historiographical event, because they started off when they were first presented as being these sort of young, rather innocent, rather noble characters. And then over the years, people tried to make out that it wasn't quite like that. There was a lot of sort of class friction and so forth. And that is true up to a point. But I think my book ended up almost coming around winning up at the beginning and saying they were actually, by and large, young, heroic, self-sacrificing, cheerful, fun-loving. They were like they appeared in the comics I read when I was growing up. As boys of my age devoured these stories about the Britain pilots. And my investigations, which were very honest, pretty much confirmed the first picture I had of them, which was nice.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to say thank you very much, Patrick Bishop, for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your book. Let's pop it up here. Paris, 1944, Occupation, Resistance, Liberation. Read the book. It's terrific. Lots of details. Was out there on the streets in Paris today. I was in a restaurant this morning and I was reading the book, and the waitress asked about it, and I was telling her about it. And she was somebody who spoke perfect English, but she was from Georgia, but not the state, the country. So, and she wanted to go out and get your book, and other people I mentioned it too. Yes, exactly. So if there's a Georgian edition, she'll be picking it up. But we thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. And we didn't even get to talk about J.D. Salinger. Jerry Salinger is there. Yeah. He's there with the 4th Armored Division, thinking about Holden Caulfield, who's a character in some of his stories. And that's just that's just a delightful surprise in the book that people can discover if they buy it and read it.
Well, and they can also be challenged by Hemingway, right?
Hemingway, who comes across as the second greatest.
This is one of the great historical literary encounters when, it's like the old champion hands over the torch to the new one with their very different kind of views of what masculinity.
I had never even thought of them in the same breath, and to know that they met multiple times, and that was crazy. So anyway, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us on History Happy Hour. We appreciate it.
Great pleasure as ever. Okay, all the best. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Okay, so now going into many live episodes for many weeks. And this next week, we're very excited to welcome John McManus, who is the author of
Fire and Fortitude,
which is the first volume of his 3-part series.
3 very thick volume.
On the Pacific. I've read it. It's terrific. I think you might like it too, and I know not to say a lot. So we're going to be talking to John. This is going to be the first of several interviews with him. So we're going to have...
Because he really wants it.
We're going to cover this whole series. We're going to catch him up. We're going to catch him up. Joe Beltoski. So guys, thank you so much for watching. Take care of yourselves.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.